The Spanish Inquisition was one of the most significant and controversial institutions during the history of Spain, and everything in regards to its institution is pretty closely tied to the complex political, religious, and social complications that were going on in, yeah, you guessed it, Spain during the late 15th century. The rise of the Spanish Inquisition, like most historical events, didn't just show up straight out of nowhere. It was the culmination of a perfect storm of a lengthy and precise series of geopolitical, historical, and religious factors, which all met at the same point of confluence and resulted in, well, you'll see. During the late 15th century, the country of Spain was undergoing a whole bunch of religious strife, as most of the world had been in that region for the last few hundred years or so, predominantly between the Muslim and Christian countries, which in the end, after quite a while of back and forth, eventually culminated in what was known as the Reconquista, a series of slow military and cultural campaigns during this period across the Spanish peninsula in the recent wake of the Crusades, and eventually in 1492 the Christian kingdoms of Castile and Aragon had successfully driven out the last Muslim stronghold, the Kingdom of Granada, straight off and out of the peninsula, and after its leader, Muhammad XII, capitulated, it marked the end of nearly 800 years of Islamic rule in that area. The rulers of those two conquering countries, Ferdinand II from Aragon and Isabella I from Castile, obviously had a pretty large part to play in all of this, as just a few years earlier, in 1469, the two of them had gotten married to each other, which unified two of the most powerful Christian kingdoms in Spain and allowed them to centralize authority and begin a campaign to bring about greater political and religious cohesion and just making everything run much more smoothly in a centralized, unified manner. Ferdinand and Isabella, while themselves not being the central focus of the whole event, each themselves have particularly fascinating lives. Ferdinand inherited Aragon from his father, John II, and married his second cousin, Isabella, the heir to the Kingdom of Castile, and Henry IV being his half-sister, and one of the first things they had to do was fight a civil war against Henry IV's supposed daughter, Joanna, which would make her Isabella's niece, kind of, maybe. They won, of course, and then turned their attentions to the previously mentioned Granada. Now, one of their first and most important priorities was that of total religious unity, which makes sense, especially given, the recent historical events and priorities at that time, and they decided to get straight into it for literally everybody in all of Spain, which they now had basically total control over, so yeah, you can see where this is going. Now, for most people that lived there, it was pretty much fine. There was a pretty sizable Catholic majority, and everybody was well and fine with that being the unifying religion. However, there were still a pretty sizable Muslim population who were still around, and of course a very sizable Jewish population who for the longest time had just sort of ended up moving down here after quite a while of running up and down all of Europe and the Middle East, trying to avoid everything going all around with the Crusades, with generally little success. So a sizable percentage of these had wound up in Spain, and actually had managed to work their way up pretty well into society, being anything from bankers, jewelers, merchants, or even working in some of the governmenting positions. So they had gotten pretty comfortable, things were going well. But now the country had turned its view inward, and instead of focusing on the people of their borders, they decided to look at their own population, so they were in for a little bit of a reckoning. Now, if there's one point about Judaism in this regard, it's that they really aren't a big fan of being force-converted into other religions, and they generally wind up in a situation like that somehow over and over throughout history, and yet somehow they keep choosing to get literally lit on fire in front of a large crowd, then drop their religion. Yet, still, in this situation, there was a very small percentage who actually had converted to Catholicism thinking that that would somehow save them, but they were labeled as conversos, and as the ruling body turned inward, they were none too happy with all the individuals who had converted, even in spite of the fact that they had done this, and especially towards the non-converted individuals, and even the conversos themselves were viewed with the highest degrees of suspicion, which was rightly so, as you'll soon see. In addition, Ferdinand and Isabella were also pretty concerned about the Moriscos Muslims who had been forced to convert to Christianity after the fall of Granada in 1492. Similar to the previous, the Moriscos outwardly professed Christianity, but they were often accused of secretly practicing Islam, which they usually wore, and the Spanish monarchy viewed them as a potential threat to religious and political unity. So, for all of the above reasons, it was decided by Ferdinand and Isabella to do something about this issue, and they decided to create an oppressively powerful institution to stop this problem once and for all, which would become known as the Spanish Inquisition. However, before you start making an inquisition, you need to get permission. It was a decision not entirely made by the royalty. The Inquisition was what's known as an ecclesiastical tribunal, which basically means that it required the approval and consent of the Catholic Church. There actually had been variations of inquisitions before in the past, however, this time they decided to operate it on a scale and level which up until this point had not even been considered, now with backing from royalty. So, now it was held under the approval and jurisdiction of the Spanish monarchy, thus making their power, sight, and reach essentially absolute. The exact process of this was that in 1478, Ferdinand and Isabella went to get permission from Pope Sixtus IV to create a tribunal with the specific purpose of investigating and prosecuting anything deemed heresy within their kingdoms. The Pope, of course, said yes, and the Spanish Inquisition was officially formally established in 1478. A papal bull, a public decree, was created, Exigit Sincere Devotionis, pardon my Latin, which means sincere devotion is required, gave the monarchs the authority to appoint inquisitors and set up a system for quashing and prosecuting any and all religious dissent, with the utmost prejudice. So yeah, this one was particularly unique as it was under royal control, unlike the past Inquisitions, which were just under the Spanish Church. So everybody answered to the king and queen, and they quickly used this authority and the monies at their availability for its requisite religious purposes, and just about anything else they wanted. However, this Inquisition needed a leader, and they found one, a man by the name of Torquemada. So, in 1483, Tomas de Torquemada, a Dominican friar, was appointed as the first Grand Inquisitor of Spain. Torquemada was a fervent supporter of religious orthodoxy and was very committed to expunging anything deemed heresy from his country. He was also kind of the worst and kind of a nut. I mean, religious zealotry doesn't really come close to describing this guy. Interestingly, his family had largely what to do with conversos, Jewish ones, that is, who worked and educated him back in his hometown, although it's very doubtful that he himself or his family was from these, despite some people saying otherwise. So, this guy was, in a word, cruel, possibly even a sociopath. He was said to be able to sign the execution of dozens and sleep like a child. He would, throughout his time, oversee tens of thousands of executions, a large amount of which had people being burnt alive at the stake, and an uncounted amount of tortures and forced confessions, perhaps numbering in at least the hundreds of thousands. He sort of set the standard for what an Inquisition was, kind of creating the whole thing with secretive investigations, public trials, and the later, more public executions, all in order to deter anything deemed heresy in a fanatical purification kind of way, and to instill a constant and oppressive fear in the populace. So yeah, you can kind of see where this is all going, but it's good to bear in mind all throughout as a background that this was the guy in charge of running everything, and soon enough the full brunt of this force, led by King and Queen Ferdinand and Isabella and the Grand Inquisitor Torquemada, would be brought crashing down upon those that lived within the country of Spain. So, first things first was expulsion. A decree was signed into law by the king and queen, which was fairly simple. Any and every Jewish family in the entire country had exactly one of two options. The first, simply, was to convert to the country's religion. This would allow you to keep your home, job, position, money, property, etc., with the only cost being that of your religion. And of course, you would still be under constant scrutiny from the Inquisition and their officers, the inquisitors, constantly watching and waiting for a misstep. The other option, as proposed in the decree, was equally simple. You would leave. This was known as the Alhambra Decree, also known as the Edict of Expulsion of the Jews. Jews, specifically, for some reason, they were singled out and forced into this decision of either conversion or expulsion. The Moriscos, the Muslim population, would have their own expulsion about a century later. For now, any conversos from either Judaism or Islam were allowed to stay. Up until this point, about 50,000 had converted. After this decree, the number had shot up to an estimated 200,000 conversions. As for the people that chose to leave, fleeing with just a few personal belongings and leaving their jobs, property, money, and homes behind to be seized by the crown, there were as many as 100,000 of them. They left on ships, going to start new lives in North Africa, Egypt, or even as far as the Ottoman Empire. Now, that number of 200,000 might seem exceedingly high in regards to the conversions, which actually makes sense because most of these people had a secret. While some, a percentage, had actually given in and converted, a massive percentage had only feigned conversion and continued to practice their religion in secret. However, this was an idea quickly figured out by the Inquisition, and they took great length to try to prevent this via a mixture of secret police, bribery to neighbors, torture, and public burnings, all things which basically become synonymous with the Inquisition. So, if you wanted to keep your religion, you had to be very, very careful. Although, to be fair, they had been being careful for the longest time previously. As mentioned, post-Crusade Europe wasn't exactly the safest place for Jews. A century or two earlier, the slaughter of Toledo occurred, and many were enslaved or killed. In Valladolid, there were pogroms carried out, burning down the synagogue to cries of "Long live King Henry," and just a short while later, the populations of Castile and Aragon were basically all but purged, with fire, torches, and knives in the hands of the common folk. Afterwards, Jewish books of scripture were banned, and they were forced to sew on little red badges to mark themselves. So none of them were exactly too thrilled with their position in Spain, so when this decree came, quite a few took this opportunity to flee while they could, at the cost, of course, of their property and jobs. Many still died on the journeys, and it was pretty questionable how safe the new countries they were moving to were, but it was still better than staying. Just about anything was, as you'll soon see. Those that chose to stay would suffer under decades of fear and paranoia at best, assuming they weren't caught every day watching friends and distant family be captured, questioned, and executed, hoping that at best they hadn't broken and turned you in too. Every knock at the door brought fear, and every casual conversation with market-goers and friends were laced with tension, and yet it was still better than those who had been caught. The exact organizational structure of the Inquisition was well made, fairly efficient, and massive in scope. The positions and roles were as follows. Firstly, at the very top, of course, was the Grand Inquisitor. The Grand Inquisitor was the highest-ranking official in the Spanish Inquisition, and held massive and utter power over the entire tribunal. The role was mainly created to just oversee the Inquisition throughout Spain and its territories, making sure that the inquisitorial practices were uniformly enforced and everything was going properly and smoothly. The Grand Inquisitor was appointed by the Spanish monarchs, although the Pope had the final approval, and in this case it was Torquemada. His role, predominantly, was to be in charge of overseeing the operations of all inquisitorial tribunals in Spain and its colonies. He had the power to initiate investigations, issue decrees, and impose punishments, which he did often. The Grand Inquisitor also acted as the key intermediary between the Spanish crown and the Vatican, ensuring that the Inquisition followed both secular and religious directives. In addition, he led the Consejo Supremo, the Supreme Council, the governing body of the Inquisition, which met together to discuss major decisions, including the condemnation of heretics and the administration of punishment. Beneath him were the standard inquisitors. Inquisitors were the low-ranking officers in the Inquisition who were tasked with carrying out investigations and trials. They themselves could be regular priests or monks, although they were often specifically ones with theological expertise and the ability to identify and prosecute heresy. The inquisitors were the guys conducting the actual interrogations and trials of accused heretics. They would gather evidence, question witnesses, and in some cases use torture to extract confessions. Inquisitors also were allowed to excommunicate individuals and hand down punishments, usually imprisonment or execution. Their power wasn't quite absolute. The Grand Inquisitor was more akin to that, but they could do as they wanted, go as they pleased, and prosecute who they wished. So, naturally, they were feared figures, they in their red robes, patrolling and questioning along. Generally, best to avoid them entirely if you had the choice, innocent or otherwise. Their jobs were to primarily investigate anything deemed heresy and report their findings back over to the Supreme Council. They were the ones working at the local level in individual cities, towns, and villages. They organized and ran networks of informants and spies, and were the ones getting their hands dirty, unlike the higher-ups of the Supreme Council. The actual role of the job kind of expected them to be impartial and to investigate cases based on evidence, but they absolutely did not, and their methods of investigation were notorious for being almost comically harsh. Then there was the Supreme Council. Their job was to be the central governing body of the Spanish Inquisition. They would set policies, oversee the comings, goings, and actions of individual inquisitors, and ensure that the inquisitors were carrying out their work according to the Church and Crown's directives. It was mainly composed of a large body of high-ranking religious and non-religious officials, including the Grand Inquisitor, the head of this body. They would manage the overall direction of the Inquisition's activities and decisions. This body was the highest authority for the Inquisition. It was these guys with the power to make final judgments on cases and would be the ones to decide whether someone should be condemned as a heretic or not. In addition, they would be the ones to appoint any new members of their order, and any new inquisitors were created through their approval alone. In fact, they would manage any case of this sort, be it heresy, witchcraft, or apostasy, and were allowed to enforce punishments, anything from fines and confiscation of property to imprisonment and execution. The Supreme Council was probably the most powerful voice in the entirety of the inquisitional body, and perhaps to some extent in all of Spain. After this were the consultors. The consultors were experts and advisors to the Supreme Council and individual inquisitors. These men were usually trained theologians or lawyers or other scholars who gave legal and doctrinal advice to inquisitors during investigations and trials. They were the ones defining and making sure everybody in the inquisitional body followed the rules, be it theological principles or legal standards. They would review cases, offer guidance or analysis on the legal and theological aspects of each crime, as to whether or not the prosecuted individual was in violation of whatever was deemed a crime, and things along those lines. Besides for that, the consultors would mainly take part in the deliberation process, assisting in the decision-making and judgment. They were generally more of an advisory role of sorts, but didn't have much to do with directly conducting investigations or trials. And then there were the notaries, who were basically just scribes and were primarily responsible for documenting the proceedings of trials and investigations. Despite their lack of exciting activities, it was, of course, absolutely vital, as being a stenographer is, what with taking certain that everything is recorded accurately. Their records were then used for future reference appeals or legal purposes in any future cases. In addition to recording data and details during legal proceedings, they also acted as clerks towards individual inquisitors. The informants are next. Pretty self-explanatory, these guys. These were largely everyday folk, motivated by either religious fervor, personal vendettas, or the desire for reward. They were rats, tattletales, even reporting on their neighbors for any of these reasons for personal gain, usually without formal pay or employ. And then, last but not least, we have the executioners. Once again, pretty self-explanatory. They were responsible for carrying out any sentences passed by the Inquisition, which were usually things along the lines of executions by burning at the stake or public displays of punishment and imprisonment. So, these were the guys doing the actual physical aspect of punishment, which in this case was usually done publicly in order to serve as a deterrent for others. So that should give you a pretty rough idea as to how the whole organization of the Inquisition or hierarchy ran. As you can see, it was a very well organized, fluid structure working both at a higher overarching level and equally at the bottom local individual point. It was a machine, and if you got caught within its gears, well, let's just say you'd be very thoroughly processed through it, and in the end, well, you can very well see what the system was designed to do. To really understood what it was like on the individual end, you'll have to understand both the terminology and the concept of a Marrano. A Marrano means pig in Spanish. It was an insulting terminology, as I'm sure you can guess, used to refer to the sizable portion of Jewish residents who had decided to stay in Spain, but instead of giving up their religion, they chose to hide, feigning their conversion, while secretly keeping to their practices and traditions, knowing that if they were caught, they would be captured, tortured, and, of course, killed. You would want to, say, keep the dietary laws of kosher, so you would feign being a vegetarian, or perhaps, if you were lucky, had a close trusted friend who worked as a butcher and could slip you kosher cuts of meat, but more likely not. So you'd go to the market and chat with the locals with a smile plastered on your face, and using cheerful words as your mask, you'd buy your food, and every Passover, you'd need a new excuse why at a random week in the middle of spring, you'd buy for a larger meal and purchase no bread for once a year. You'd have to only keep what you could. Some traditions are just too difficult. Not sure really how you'd have a sukkah built once a year, but you could try. You'd come home on a Friday to your relieved family, lock your doors, shade your windows, and take out candles. They'd be lit, and you'd make kiddush, a prayer over a cup of wine to usher in the Shabbos. Any and every Jewish book of prayer or scripture had to be buried away, hidden in your home, perhaps in a secret compartment in your cupboard, perhaps beneath a loose floorboard. So you would do it quickly, quietly, with select family and friends. If someone knocked at the door, all contraband would be rushed away, and everybody had to act normal and calm and happy. The kids had to be taught to do this too. And that's how it went, week after week, month after month, for years, until one day you were finally caught. How? It wouldn't matter. Perhaps someone in the market had grown suspicious, perhaps a neighbor had peered through the windows, perhaps someone you trusted gave you away for reward or for the sake of another. But in the end, the result would be the same. You would hear a knock at the door, and the dreaded uniform of the Inquisition would appear and whisk you away, along with your family, if you were unlucky, to the dungeons beneath the Inquisitional headquarters. There, you would be locked in a cell and tortured for hours or days or weeks, inquisitively probing for you to give in any of the others of your friends or family who hadn't been caught yet. You'd be offered conversion as an escape, or more likely, a swifter death. The actual torture has detailed particulars. Torture was legally sanctioned and considered a legitimate means to obtain information by the Inquisition, of course. The torture was designed to break the will of the accused and force them to confess their guilt. There was what was known as the strappado, in which the accused arms were tied behind their back, and the person was hoisted into the air and then dropped, causing extreme pain and probably breaking their arms. Another common form was the waterboarding technique, where water was poured over your mouth and nose, sometimes over a cloth, to simulate drowning. Then there was the breaking wheel, where a person was tied to a giant wheel and then beaten. Not sure why they needed the wheel, but whatever. There was the rack, where a person was tied to a whole contraption which stretched and pulled your limbs in opposite directions, which sounds unpleasant. And there was the Iron Maiden, which is like a giant metal coffin, which you'd be stuffed inside of, and the door had spikes, so that way when it was shut, you'd get poked a whole bunch. There was also the Spanish boot, where your legs would be placed inside of large steel boots and would then have steel wedges and spikes driven through holes in the boot, which caused severe damage to your legs. Also, there was a pillory, which is a bit more classical. Have your head encased in a wooden wedge and then have people throw stuff at you. You could have your skin flayed off in bits and pieces or all at once. Sleep deprivation was often used, and there was also the iron collar, which was an iron collar with spikes, making you unable to move around without getting spiked. Lastly, there was the thumbscrew, which was a little vice that was apparently favored by Torquemada, which was put around your thumb and then did some pretty upsetting things to it, usually involving screws. So that would give you a pretty general idea as to what was going on down there, along with, of course, basically any other form of unpleasant treatment you can imagine, as, believe you me, these guys were experts and had quite a lot of time to practice. The Inquisition did not actually use torture in every case. It was mainly reserved for people refusing to give in to conversion, or people suspected of knowing the locations and names of similar others, but one thing was for certain. Whether or not you went in claiming innocence, whether or not that was true, everybody left admitting to guilt and anything else desired by the torturers. And so, the trial. After the interrogation, the accused was formally brought to trial. This was generally publicly done, with the inquisitors reading the charges and the confession, if one had been obtained, which it usually was. The accused was not allowed to have a lawyer or a defense counsel, and the trial was a typically one-sided process, basically a mock affair, with the decision essentially pre-decided. In many cases, the inquisitors would actually present their evidence against the accused, which was usually pretty vague or circumstantial and definitely wouldn't hold up in any modern court, but hey, it worked for them, so they were sentenced. Punishments could range from more lighter in the form of penances, such as pilgrimages or acts of public penance, to the more common, which was simply execution. The most severe form of punishment for heresy was burning at the stake, which was a public spectacle designed to simultaneously punish the individual and deter others from engaging in any heretical practices. If you actually did decide at some point to renounce your religion, they could give you a lighter sentence, at best quick banishment, and a confiscation of everything you owned, more commonly a quick and quiet execution. And if not, well, you'd have an auto de fe. An auto de fe, or an act of faith, was one of the most public and feared practices of the Spanish Inquisition. It was a public ceremony in which the final sentences of the Inquisition were carried out. It was an execution by fire. The accused individual would be dragged out of his cell by inquisitors a little while after his sham of a trial, and then brought outside for the first time in weeks. You'd be brought bound through a procession to the front of a massive, jeering, cheering crowd, where a stake had been prepared for you at the front of the central city square, along with a few others for those who would also be executed this day. Some were forced into a garment called a San Benito, a yellow or red garment with sewn on demons and flames, which a condemned individual would be executed in. Your crimes would be read out to the crowd. There would be speeches, prayers, and proclamations of faith. You'd be tied to the stake, and it would be lit. And then the individual would be burnt to death before a cheering crowd. It was also an event that was mandatory for all members of the city to attend and watch, so often any remaining friends and family who hadn't yet been caught would be among the crowd, this serving as a reminder to what would happen to them if they were discovered. As for everybody else, well, I'm sure it was somewhat entertaining. There was probably snacks, and I doubt there was much other entertainment in 15th century Spain. The actual purpose of all this was intended to act as a deterrent, sending a clear message to society that heresy would not be tolerated under any circumstances, and to exercise the power and authority of the Inquisition. On the individual level, this created a blanket of total and utter fear over everybody, guilty or otherwise, between the informants, inquisitors, spies, tortures, the imposing tower of the inquisitional headquarters, the constant public burnings, the citizens you knew who vanished in the night, and the suffering of those associated with them. And that's nothing to say if you were of the individuals who had kept hold of your religion despite everything, and somehow there was a shocking amount of them. There were thousands of auto de fes held constantly during the many years that the Inquisition reigned, and it's still unknown how many they killed, although the estimates are in the hundreds of thousands at a minimum. In fact, in addition to all of that, but their methods and their persistent aura of fear set science, logic, and reasoning back quite a while in that region, what with anyone doing academic research afraid of being branded a heretic for the wrong discovery and have their work destroyed, and usually their life alongside with it. Many intellectuals, philosophers, and scientists were targeted by the Inquisition for their beliefs, ideas, writings, or otherwise, resulting in a severe suppression of free thought. So Spain's intellectual and cultural development was severely hindered by the Inquisition's tight grip on ideas, which resulted in the discouragement of any intellectual inquiry and innovation. And that wasn't all. Before the establishment of the Inquisition, the Jewish community in Spain was a pretty significant player in the economic landscape. Jews were involved in various vitally important sectors, things like banking, trade, medicine, craftsmanship, and otherwise. They were moneylenders, helping finance the monarchy's wars and the needs of any local businessmen. They were also engaged in trade with North Africa, the Middle East, and other parts of Europe, which was pretty important to Spain's commercial success. In addition, many Jews were highly educated and held important positions in society, stuff like medicine, scientific fields, and philosophy. So, by exiling this massive percentage of necessary additive members of their community and straight up killing the rest, that wreaked severe economic ruin on their country, as killing hundreds of thousands of your population for religious ideological reasons is bound to do. Previously, Jews and conversos had played significant roles in the financial networks that sustained both the Spanish monarchy and its economy. The loss of these communities' expertise in banking and finance via their, execution or banishment greatly hindered Spain's economic development, particularly in any areas involving commerce, agriculture, or craftsmanship. So, it resulted in serious and severe stagnation for the economy of that period, Spain, and also that's nothing to say of the massive cost running and funding the Inquisition itself, which was a sizable and costly endeavor, especially for the length of time it was running, and especially as the money it brought in was confiscated, which is not self-sustainable, as you're gonna run out eventually. I mean, if you need money, you can always just confiscate from and just banish another guy, but still, this whole thing was kind of difficult to fund. In fact, on a different level, there was a running issue of individual people, opportunists, basically just accusing their neighbors, utilizing the persistent aura of fear and trepidation to ruin their business rivals or economically destroy another guy out of personal vendetta by levying false accusations against innocent people, which further crippled their economy, eroded trust, tore communities apart, and led near enough every common individual to further condense themselves publicly, to avoid as much attention as possible, keeping to secrecy, and avoiding the notice of their neighbors, whether for wealth or otherwise. So, for all these reasons, Spain as a whole began to decline as a global power, hemorrhaging money and the respect of other nations traded for absolute power and control on the local level. It took as long as reaching to the 17th century for Spain to reclaim their full power, with territorial control extending as far as the Americas and the Netherlands. Interestingly, it was actually Queen Isabella herself who would soon after send out a man named Christopher Columbus to sail across the ocean and discover a new country, the Americas, which would a while after gain its independence and, in a dramatic twist of irony, become essentially a safe haven for any and all religions as a beacon of religious tolerance for the rest of the world. The Inquisition itself finally ended in the early 1800s after nearly 350 years of operation. It ended for many reasons. The Enlightenment was a significant factor. Higher thinkers, men like Voltaire and John Locke, spread ideas of self-determination and criticizing the preventing of free thought by the hands of the Spanish Inquisition, which, over enough time, began to sway public opinion. Napoleon's conquering of France and incursion into Spain helped, as he temporarily overthrew the Spanish monarchy of this later time and greatly weakened the Church's power, to the point where he issued a decree in 1808 which specifically inhibited the Inquisition's control. Spain then took upon themselves the Cadiz Constitution, which temporarily abolished the Inquisition. A short while later, King Ferdinand VII reinstituted the monarchy and re-established the Inquisition, but eventually it ended properly as Spain modernized and the regent Maria Cristina abolished it for good. But to some extent, the Inquisitional force just kind of burned itself out. 3.5 centuries is quite a long while to run an institution which exists almost entirely to strike fear in your citizens and exercise control over them, and eventually it just kind of ran out of steam and petered out over time. Like most things, it didn't go out with a bang, but with a whimper. Tomás de Torquemada eventually died a while later of an illness of some sorts, and his tomb was ransacked in 1832, just 2 years before the Inquisition was officially disbanded. Allegedly, his bones were stolen and incinerated in the same manner as an auto-da-fe. The Jews of that area mostly rebuilt themselves, particularly Jews from that area, called Sephardi Jews, as opposed to European Ashkenazi Jews, and now they have a pretty sizable Jewish community. Plus, I think Spain issued a formal apology for the whole thing, like maybe 20 years ago, so that was pretty cool of them.